they want it to be television, like mad, screaming, pulling out their hair and stuff like that. And while every once in a while something like that will kind of happen on 30 days, it doesn't really. I think it takes it much more realistic. It still takes people with very different views and puts them together. But what happens is, to me, more realistically, kind of thing can happen when that happens and wife swap, where it's sometimes so ridiculous. You know what I mean? I believe personally, when I watch a lot of these reality shows, don't you sometimes get the impression that they put people up for a lot of stuff that happens? Yeah. Right? That there's a director sitting there and they're like, hey, how about we introduce this little controversy and see how it goes? And 30 Days is done where the guy that lives with them has the camera, like Survivor Man. You know what I'm saying? So there are no tricks. The people who take the pictures are not on site. The person that's following them around is instructed only to utilize the camera, or the person themselves utilizes the camera, right? 30 Days. It's a TV show that was on FX for 3 seasons. And these people switch, they, like basically 130 Days, you take a conservative Christian from Michigan, and he comes and lives with a gay guy in the Casper of San Francisco, right? And it's basically like what happens when those two people interact with one another in state. You take a bunch of commercial people who are like frat boys and frat girls, and take one frat guy and one frat girl, and then you put them on a commune, and you see how that all works out, see how it plays out. That was one of the most interesting ones, because one of the frat guys on the show, actually, what I think was interesting about that one was that the people that they went to visit probably got more hairy than the people that came to visit. And a lot of times the people that come to visit are the ones who have to experience all this, like, wow, I didn't understand, wow, my perceptions are different. But in the case of the commune, people on the commune were so rigid and tight in their way of doing things that these other people came there and did things that I think are probably totally legitimate. They really, really needed the commune. Like one of the guys that went there, he was like, I'm tired of all your like tofu and disgusting food that you're trying to eat. So he got himself a gun and he started shooting animals and eating them, right? And there's no way that doesn't jive with what they're doing on the commune. It does. It's just that they're all vegetarians, and they were like, well, if you're going to do that, you can't poop in our toilets because we use our food to fertilize our content. And if you put meat in your food, then it's going to create bacteria in the environment. So you're going to have your own outhouse. And of course, you utilizing meat, it creates problems. So you're going to have to do it in the back of your house, and we don't want to see it, and all this other stuff. And then people will come along and be like, why are you eating animals? Eating animals is evil. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting one in particular, because it kind of revealed a lot of things about all the sides. But anyway, the point is, we'll do an assignment where we're basically going to watch the one about immigration, the one that he watched on the internet, that the conversation started. It's already on it. And I have a worksheet that goes with that to learn something about perspectivity and cognitive dissonance. And for me, that's what 30 Days is about. It's about cognitive dissonance. How do you deal with people who think differently than you? How do you deal with exposure to ideas that are different? A lot of us don't respond initially very positively, right? When somebody says something, replies and says something, or does something that we disagree with, our natural first reaction is kind of like revulsion or fear, right? When in reality, we maybe should react with more like surprise and compassion. You know what I'm saying? But we kind of leave with that kind of. So 30 Days becomes a skill by seeing it. All right, and hey, listen, if you haven't picked up your speeches, they're here. I know that there are a lot of people who aren't here, so that explains why there are so many speeches, but I just want to let you know. The speech grades were good. I think we're talking about like maybe 1 C in the entire class, and every single person passed. So my prediction that if you show up on speech day and do your speech, you're likely to pass or even get an A or a B has come to fruition. So again, I remind you, the same thing is true of previous speeches to come. If you come and do your speech on speech day and you do it the way you're supposed to, you won't be subject to the 20% reduction, and you're almost guaranteed to make an A or a B. And then certainly a C. I would almost 100% guarantee that. I think in 15 years of doing these things this way, I think I've only had 2 or 3 people, maybe 10 people total in 15 years who got like a 68 or a 69 as a result of their speech that they gave on speech day. But I mean, think about that. That's different than like a 58 or a 48 or a 49, which is what they probably would have gotten And if you're talking about a 68 or 69, you're only 2 points off of a C, right? That's super close. And so again, I impassionately suggest to you that you're better off showing up on speech day, doing speeches day, even if you're not prepared. Right? You're better off just doing something off the cuff because you're almost assured to pass. And on the other hand, you make it up more sure. So I don't think I can be any plainer than that. And what happened with the narrative speeches when they bear that out? As a matter of fact, I would say we probably had about a 75% pay rate, right? So almost everybody got an A. And if you want to get a sense of whether it was an A, B, or C, all you got to do is double your score, right? Double your score, and that gives you a sense of what percentage out of 100 you have. Okay? Now, let me explain the assignments. We've got 3 grades there, and then there's some chicken scratch for some of you, so I'm sure you guys want to know what I wrote there. So first off, the first score is your evaluation score. And I want to remind you that I was grading you based on fair grading, right? And so my comments to you are clustered in 3 basic areas. First off, some people didn't tally their scores. And so if you need to tally your scores, that means you didn't give me a total out of 50 at the bottom. And that's not as important on this assignment as it is on future assignments, because, like say on the impromptu speech, that means I'll have 5 evaluations to fill in the bottom score on. And in the informative speech, I'm going to have like 10 evaluations to fill in the bottom score on. So the bottom line is, as we progress in speeches, and I tell you to tally your scores, and you don't, I'm going to take off increasing the points. Right? That's the first thing, tally scores. The second thing, score variance. So I would say vary scores, right? So you might see that there, vary your scores. That means you gave everybody like 46, gave everybody a 47. And sometimes I even look back, I'm not saying everybody's guilty of this, but I'll often look back at the evaluation forms, and I'll see that you circled the exact same numbers on both of the evaluation forms. So not only did you give them the exact same score, but you gave them the exact same score, which suggests to me that perhaps laziness is important, right? So again, I take off a point for that, for score variance, because we want to give some people 44s and other people 48s, because that's probably what you're really looking at, right, from a realistic rating standpoint. So that's another one. And then, of course, the ones that you actually lose large amounts of points for are the provide more comments, criticism, and suggestions. So like, for example, if you just gave me the numbers and wrote nothing down on the evaluation forms, you received a 2 out of 10. And that will become a 1 out of 10 in the future, because all you did was filled in the numbers, right? You did the minimum. So I'm giving you the minimum, right? So in the end, yes, thank you for filling in the numbers. Now I have something to average. But on the other hand, you took off points. And I'm telling you right now, if I received a paper where you gave me a 45 out of 50 and you wrote nothing down, I'm mad, right? I'm mad because I wonder, why'd you take off 5 points if you didn't write anything down? Now, the only other time I would be almost as mad, so if I got back an evaluation form that had all good things on it, like all great things that I did, and I still got like a 44 out of 50. I'm thinking to myself, if I did all those great things, why'd you give me a 44? Why did you give me a 50? Right? But the answer is, I was scared to give you a 50 because I'm afraid Eric would take off points for score variance, and he told me not to give everybody 50s. But that's not an adequate response, right? What I told you to do was grade responsibly and accurately. And if you graded responsibly and accurately, I bet you didn't watch a single speech. And there were plenty of things that you could have said to the individual speakers that could be improved or needed improvement. So, those of you who received 2 out of 10, fair warning, it'll be 1 out of 10 next time. And really, in the end, you're not just, I have no stake in this matter. It's really the people who get the papers back from you who get angry when they look at their papers and realize that you took off 5 points and you didn't tell them one single reason why. Right? Don't you agree? That's irritating. Right? If you get that back. And so if you're one of those people, I apologize. But I'm taking those people over my knee, am I not? Right? For those of you who got back blank evaluation forms and comments and points, we're definitely giving you one. So there's that. On the other hand, sometimes I said provide more criticism, comments, and suggestions. And then based on, like, normally, if I'm giving you that comment, I'm starting at 8 out of 10. Right? So like if I'm saying provide more criticism, comments, and suggestions, then I start at 8, and then basically I look at what you did, and if I think it still wasn't, it was more inadequate than just 8, then I'll go down to 7 or 6 or 5 based on how much of an infraction I think there is. Right? Like if you provided no criticism whatsoever, but you provided some comments and maybe a suggestion, then I probably gave you a 6 or a 7 out of 10. Right? If you just put a bunch of words on there that weren't suggestions, but they were all just like, hey, way to go, good job, fantastic, way to go, good job, I might have given you a 4 or a 5 out of 10 because you're not really providing them adequate information. You're certainly not telling them anything that would improve their speeches. All you're being like is, hey, good job, way to go, fantastic. All right, rubber stamp. Right? So again, that's how you improve your points in the future. Write more comments and suggestions. Write more criticism for the individual speakers. Stay stay frosty on the difference between telling them something they did right and making sure that you're pointing out something they need to do better in the future. Right? So again, those are the things that we're looking for. Any questions about what you got there? The other thing is your narrative score. Your narrative score is a score out of 10. Most people got 10 out of 10. But if your narrative wasn't about values, then I might have given you an 8 out of 10. If your narrative didn't really explain things or wasn't sufficiently long enough or didn't have enough information for me to make a judgment, I might have given you an 8 out of 10. If your narrative had some other structural flaw in it, like, for example, you told me a story of like a year in your life rather than focusing on a single event, then I might have taken off a couple of points there because I actually told you specifically a couple of different times to focus on a single event, not the summer of 2006. And then just focus on what happened over that period of time. And some people did it like this one friend that they had over a number of years, and then they kind of told the story of the one friend over a number of years. And again, that's still the same basic thing. You haven't chosen one event in the life of that friend. You told the life of that friend over a number of years, which isn't really a very clear story, right? It isn't an event that we're focusing on. That's kind of a symbol for all of those years. It's all those years, right? Which is kind of so, point of the matter is, nobody got below an 80 on the narrative level. And if you did, then you had 2 problems. Okay? And even then, you're talking about a 70. Nobody gets below a 70 on their narrative. So, there you go, right? Everybody passed their narrative. But again, some people might have gotten an 8 out of 10 as a result of the things that I just talked about. And then, of course, the grade that you receive on your actual speech is an average of the evaluation forms. You can check that for yourself. Sometimes the old calculator doesn't do it right. I actually had 2 evaluation forms. One was a 43 and the other was a 45. And then when the number came out in my calculator, it was 46.5. I was like, how's that possible? Either of these numbers was above 46. That can't happen. So I've actually caught my calculator making wrong calculations. And it could be user error, don't get me wrong. But the point is, go ahead and check because you never know. Right? So you might average those things together and then divide them by however many times. Any questions about the assignment? Yeah.
So, are grades for the speech?
Yes, that's the actual grade on the speech. So what the grade out of 50 is, 46 out of 50. So you got 46 points on the possible. Those are daily grades. They go in the daily work category. They're 10-point grades for all out of 50. Okay? Is that clear? Kristen. Okay, well, we have the fairy tale, don't we? And so what I want to do here is I'm going to put you in groups, and I want you as a group to come up with a solution. I know, I can see. You're like, oh, dude, I was hoping I could just stay alone and I wouldn't have to justify myself to a whole group of people, but no, that's how it's going to be. So I'm going to group you up. Let's make you 6 people here. You 6. You guys are a group there. Let's make you 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You 5 are a group there, and then you 6 are a group here. Okay? You 6.
I count.
You 5. You 6. Okay, and basically what you're doing is you're going to put everybody in order based on a set of criteria that applies to each character in the story, and then you're going to come up with that order as a group, and then we're going to discuss it and your reasoning. And then I bet you that's all we get done, because the discussions go on and on. Hey, before we get started, though, I want to point a couple of things out, okay? And I point a couple of things out before we get started. All right. First off, you remember the example that I used for you, where somebody puts a gun to my head and then says, "Give me your money," and then I say, "No, I don't cooperate with criminals," and then he shoots me in the head, and I ask you who's responsible for that, and you guys all respond to the gunman. You remember this discussion, right? And in that situation, I just want to point out that compliance with the gunman is an immoral act. You understand that? Does everybody understand that? Even if I am standing there with my son, and the gunman puts the gun to my son's head and says, "Give me all your money or I'll kill your son," and I say, "I do not cooperate with criminals," I have made a moral statement, have I not? And it is right not to cooperate with criminals, correct? In fact, one could make the argument that if someone is suggesting a criminal act, it is actually your moral obligation to refuse, right? But there is a part of you that's like, "I'm going to let your kid get killed, so you can keep money." I mean, isn't that right? Is there a part of you that says that? Am I correct? Yeah, I understand. But you understand that ethics is about curbing your basic instincts, right? I believe me. Good. I'm not saying it's a perfect world. But what I'm saying is morality is about trying to design said perfect world. And so morality is about wrong and right. Right? But sometimes what those words mean can be up to question. Okay? And all I'm saying is there's a difference between wrong and right, and the end justifies the means. Okay? And so while it is morally wrong for me to comply with the criminal, because I recognize that my child's life matters more to me than morality, I make an immoral decision based on an end justifying the means. Of course, more morally wrong than holding on to my money, right? But what we've got here is two wrongs, right? So we have to make a decision between which wrong is more important than the other wrong, correct? So we are not discussing morality here. We are discussing deciding which is more important and making an ends means justification, right? But we're recognizing that with the gun to my child's head, participating in that criminal act by giving the guy the money is still wrong. Is it not?
I guess I that. In your situation, Gabby was raising, yes, he's all at fault for you die. Well, let's change this. Let's say we're in this classroom, you're a gunman at the hallway, you need to be in the classroom across the hall. If you decide to go across the hall, are you partially responsible for dying because you knew of the danger you were doing something?
Well, you bear some responsibility, but in no way could you bear more responsibility.
No.
In no way could you bear more responsibility than the individuals who, for example, sent them in there. Or like, for example, if somebody's like, and look, if you don't, you weren't supposed to go to class in the first place because I'm your boyfriend and I beat you up if you leave the home while I'm gone, and then you end up in the classroom because you made a choice to leave the home. That doesn't mean that the boyfriend isn't responsible.
No, but I was trying to get across was in your initial thing, you bear no responsibility. It wasn't your fault at all.
Yeah, what you're saying here is my obligations toward others count in terms of my ability to come up with an ethical framework. And I'm with you. That's the essence of ends means, right? Because what you've recognized is we really got two wrongs here. And so how do I make a decision between which wrong is better than the other wrong? And the way you do it is by acting on behalf of others. Am I correct? Right? And so in that situation, you must always keep your eye on the ball. What is my level of responsibility to other people? And at that point, I might have to make this ends means justification because my level of responsibility to others outweighs my level of responsibility to myself. Right? But nonetheless, I shouldn't be in that situation, should I? I shouldn't have to be in that situation. So no matter what, I'm not responsible for why it's happening. Right? The people who introduce violence into the equation are responsible for why there's a dead person. Right? If there had been no violent character introduced into the equation, there would be no dead person. Correct? Right? So all I'm saying here is there's a difference between, in the abstract, something that is right and wrong, which is a question of ethics, and making the argument that while I recognize both things are wrong, I have to decide between those two things because the end justifies the means. And all I'm saying here is normal morality uses both, right? On the one hand, you have an obligation to yourself, and there's a question of wrong or right. But on the other hand, you've got to look at whether the end justifies the means sometimes, right? But on the other hand, that doesn't make you right. That just makes you making a strategic calculation of consequences, right? And there is ethics. There is some morality to that, but it is a lesser morality than absolute morality, the question of what is right and what is wrong. And all I'm saying here is this equation kind of compares and tests both of those things, right? And when you're looking at this, you need to keep that in mind. You need to keep in mind who is responsible for when that guy puts that bullet through my head or through my kid's head. Who's ultimately responsible for that, right? Even if I had the knowledge of what that guy was going to do, when I said I don't cooperate with criminals, in the end, no one would be dead if a criminal, idiot criminal had walked up with guns. Right? And so that I think is relevant. You see how it's relevant, don't you? Right? And essentially what you're saying here is that ultimately the victims at 9/11, well, let's ferret out who was good and who was bad. Let's figure out whether the end justifies the means on each of the victims. See what I'm saying? And sometimes that's not even productive. I mean, we agreed already, actually, that that's not productive, that doesn't make sense at all. Right? And so keep those things in mind when you're discussing this. Right? Keep those things in mind about the level of accountability that flows. And then the other thing that I had a problem with the last class, I'm going to mention it again, and that is you got to use the same criteria for each of the characters. Right? So if you put it in order based on a set of criteria and you arrived at number 1 based on that criteria, then each person after that should be using the same criteria. If we, for example, use one criteria for number 1 and number 2, and then we revert back to another criteria for the remaining characters in the story, we're not being consistent. Okay? And I'm gonna have some things to say about it. Okay? So keep those things in mind when you're discussing. So off you go. Off you go. I just wanted to say those things before you get started so you understood that there was a difference between something that is in the abstract wrong and right and something where we make a judgment based on it. Well, I think that there is an order that is easier and is based on what I would call a sounder form of ethics. And I think if we proceed according to that form of ethics, everybody could easily come up with the same answer rather than everything.
I know, but like, if you could avoid it. Yeah,
yes, yeah, the group, she's got one right there where it's like, hey, we're going to have to come up with a group order. So absolutely, the process of negotiation.
No, but she that's what she would have died in her back. But then she would have had to worry about yes, but she would have not died that way. That was the story. Would it not happen if they died in this story?
No, but then I'm over.
I don't think because of the sources for being interpreted for something.
Someone or something that does like leadership and actually.
So I'm driving double right and either way. So that's really not should be always whether or not for instance the second
I always do this one. Like respect them and say, okay, it's like the bank. You're using it and she left the house talking about compromise. See their side and do your side and understand it. Don't argue about it. Actually,
The man that was the one that killed her. So Bowman wouldn't take her across the.
Oh yeah, okay. I make sense.
How is my plan?
Well, yeah, I understand y'all.
She's second.
But whether or not she works with her it is scared. Then it's like I want to keep just
Yeah, he just told us.
I want to too. Yeah, but it's the fact that that's it's not bad.
Why would the madman do
It
that?
says whether they're 1 and 2 and because there was a possibility that she would be leaving and going back. Then she left, she could have gone back and gone and but also that is she's dying. And it's not because he's the one who didn't kill her. She didn't know herself. I think it
I
would make a
put
lot
the
more
madman was responsible for work right there.
response. I know you are responsible.
What's your responsibility?
Responsibility.
Dude, she was close. She was specifically told.
Like the when she leaves,
Third one.
don't have it, it's her responsibility to warn her. And so it's not his fault.
Fourth was the weapon. He wouldn't
What's
answer.
your criteria? You know what that is?
I know that.
Fifth was the
Now, your criteria is what makes him responsible.
And the actions means the actions the actions follow the scenes of the how
I'm gonna try to skip some of the
I don't know more than what I actually put down.
yes, it's what said.
That's it.
Well, what did you initially go with?
Initially, I went with the princess.
Yes, exactly.
She was steady. So that this would happen. And then I put the madman as second because, well, madman killed me. Like, once as a kid. Three, I put the prince. He established responsibility. Right.
What's your,
Four, I put the lover because, despite being lovers, they don't wasn't a kid for months. And the five, I put the best friend because
my criteria is, you can pull your own friend, but so they all are responsible for what they did. Someone else will say, don't do this.
it's super with the whole man because he's just trying to run it.
You're aware of the effects of your actions, so everyone is aware of what's going to happen. Like what? And you reason before you make a reply. And so if you're reasoning before you do something, then you respond.
Because it's the roles that I said,
Okay. What I did was number one, of course, had the madman.
Okay, so
He physically threw her off the bridge. She was the
Princess,
cause
first and second there.
number two, I had the princess. She put herself.
I just want to love it.
She knew
Because that's the reason I love the best friend that you make your I didn't say no, I didn't.
because he had
He's full.
the ability to change something. And take her across the reason she died was she had found intercepted
She went back
best
to
friend
that
ever
house.
because he didn't give her it went her close because they number five was her best friend because her best friend also wanted her to talk about her best friend. And number six,
Yeah,
her
but
friends.
that was like
Nothing.
you couldn't stay there. Like you eventually knew you were going to face death and go back to Ghana and then die. So you know you go to die.
Number four, I had her
No,
friend.
because
Five.
that's the reason.
And number five, I had her best friend.
Because she's standing outside the if she's standing outside the friend comes back. What? You're dead. She's gonna die no matter what, so why not make it? So you think this is a suicide
But
story?
I agree with the madman. The I mean, obviously the madman was responsible for her death. I mean, if she was punished, if it wasn't, he physically just threw her over.
The only person that did it was the
Okay, let's get some
Okay, I put best friend as number four because he didn't throw really. All he did was run through the and so I really can't fault for that. The goat man was a businessman and he was one. And the princess
Same.
he just said, you're in danger. And
But then charging on that.
I mean, that's not.
Okay. Does anyone agree with what they agree? 5 minutes.
Alright, what's number 4?
Number 4, I put was best friend.
Okay.
Yeah,
You had the prince and princess of being
I put Magnus.
Why is Magnet number 4?
See, I
Yeah,
thought
but
they were more.
why is it number 4?
That puts a different thought. Yeah. Dude, there's a lot of edible crap out there. So.
The best friend also is gay. He said if I cross the fence, it's stealing. Actually, I agree. She got back to cancer.
And she had money after What's up, 3?
But at the same time, you can't take the plane right. Yeah. 3 after 4. Because he's this reason like that.
Interesting.
So he was aware of the effects of that. He wasn't really fixing it. And that's what we did. He said, how do we do this?
But if he knows, he knew that.
The problem with calling the dog is that when it is that he was on his way. He also established the thing that if she left, he would kill her. Yeah. It says
Yeah, and I think that was really risky.
Very
Or someone
tough.
else's life risky. So here's what I think is
Either way.
And to some degree.
how do you know if they, how do you know if she left?
I love that we're discussing a bunch of guards that isn't even talking about.
Everyone knows that they know.
Yeah, she left.
So, they would agree,
It's rumored over here in the water.
They're just being like,
They had 15-minute rotations. They walked around the perimeter.
Right.
What if she was dressed up like some, like one of the South peasants?
best friend mother of three boys. Okay, so what's the reason for this?
My number 4 is the
Wow, okay, so that's-
Exactly. So how
She brought out money.
Probably just
Very much.
Maybe she did a very spectacular I'm thinking that was that. So you have to narrow it down to between the best friend and one of my man and the at least you do know.
I mean, so she could have disguised herself as a peasant, walked out of the castle.
Or the guards might
Exactly.
Right. Right.
I agree with it. Let's put the mother at 53.
And then the
The place along with the flow.
And then for here.
So y'all
How's
are
it going? You guys got on?
No, we're still discussing.
You know what? My mother and best friend are two.
Maybe I can throw some stuff into the mix, make more different.
Okay, were the guards on 15-minute rotation?
I'm not sure that's relevant.
Probably not, but it's something we've managed to get right.
They're not in the story. You should focus on all the information that's coming in the story. Right? Focus on the information that you have, because we need to refer to evidence to back up our conclusions, and the only source of evidence we have is this. So to appeal to the lack of evidence would be
Yes, so,
right? So we don't want to appeal to the lack of evidence. Now we can make assumptions potentially, like for example, I think a reasonable assumption of the story is that she was dating the lover before the story began. Right? This isn't like she cruised into town and found herself a lover, and then, returned back to the castle after meeting the lover for the first time. Right? So that's I think a clear assumption of the story. I think there's a reasonable assumption that she fears the prince enough that she's willing to risk her life to return to the castle. So I don't think the claim that I've heard bandied around here by some people, I don't know if you guys are doing it, that the prince isn't serious about his threats is realistic, because not only is the princess willing to go back into this for life, but the best friend in the story says he's going to. Right, so you're talking about the kind of man who will anyone he crosses. So he's a serious guy. Right? He's not just some jokester who issues threats. He's the kind of guy who really will kill you. So I think that's a factor to consider. Would you agree? I'd like to know your criteria. That's what I think about that. You know what I'm saying? Because, see, the one thing I'm going to give you a hard time about when we start to talk about this is if you put it in an order where the first couple of 2 or 3 people don't have a clear set of criteria, and then you revert back to a set of criteria. You need to use the same criteria for all, right? There needs to be a consistent set of criteria. That makes sense. But let me throw this out there, because I have been hearing this discussion from your group and the other group. Ethics isn't just about your obligations to yourself. As a matter of fact, what really makes a difference in ethics is your obligations to others. That's really the fundamental of ethics. Because, like, you remember the example I gave you of putting on my parachute, jumping out of the plane, and everybody else there, including my kid, right? We understand that that's unethical, even though I'm serving my own needs. You understand? Which means that you're not always responsible for what happens to you. A lot of times what happens to you is a collective responsibility. And in the same vein, how you behave once bad situations have started is in a sense a way of gauging who's behaving ethically. And ultimately, those who behave ethically should be ranked lower. You understand that? So ask yourself, do any of these characters in this story have other people's needs?
Now, what y'all are saying, it is her.
Does any person in the story help people in any way?
They're gunmen and
Really?
Then I'm gonna say the monster.
Ask yourself this. What are the alternative behaviors of the characters in the story? Is there who in the story is complicit in violence, and who here is trying to avoid violence?
But you didn't kill yourself.
Is trying to avoid violence, absolutely. There's one other character in the story that's trying to avoid violence. Who would that be? Absolutely, the victim. The victim wants to avoid violence because the violence directly affects said victim. Right? So you've got two characters in the story that are deliberately avoiding violence. And then you have 2 characters in the story that are violent by nature. Who would those be? So, if you've got 2 violent characters in the story, ask yourself this. Would any of the violence in the story have happened without those characters? As a matter of fact, if Mad Men hadn't been there, then the Prince's edicts don't matter because she could get back to the castle. If the Prince isn't there, then the Mad Men doesn't matter because she could just stay in the city. Right? So ultimately, there are 2 characters that are responsible for all of the violence in the story.
So,
Well, I'm just throwing something out there, right? I'm just telling you. And there are 2 characters in the story who behave deliberately non-violent. And then you have a bunch of characters that are complicit in the violence because they refuse to help, right? And so the question you have to ask yourself is not who's fulfilling their responsibility to themselves and what responsibility to yourself you have. Because everybody in the story has done something wrong. The question you have to ask yourself is,
if you stay here, you have
who is complicit in the outcome of the story as a result of their actions in the story? Who didn't fulfill their obligations to others?
If we run as fast as we can out that door,
and what is their level of obligation?
get past the gun.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, you get that.
Okay, do you remember we discussed the difference between being a hero and just being, like, you could literally be a villain if you were only taking care of yourself, right? Because that's selfishness. Now, admittedly, selfishness does have virtue at times, right? There are times when taking care of yourself is the moral thing to do. right? But on the other hand, morality is really about your obligations to others. And so who in this story fulfilled their obligations to others in a moral way, and who didn't? I think that's an easier way to work.
I agree, but she's not throwing herself over there.
See what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying, but I think that's also looking something different.
We're one to
That's more, who's responsible for it.
No, I think accountability is a question of right and wrong. Ends and means is a question that we come to when we decide that everybody is wrong and nobody is right. Right? But in this case, remember our discussion of heroes? Heroes sacrifice themselves for others. So ask yourself, is there a character in the story who sacrifices everything to make sure other people don't hurt?
What?
Really?
What?
Nobody. Nobody sacrificed everything. Because someone
No,
else sacrificed.
No, but let's just say this. If you, like for example, if I'm a rape victim, I'm running down the road and I knock on doors, and at every door, someone comes to the door and it's like, I don't want you to ask me to help you because you're making me part of this thing that's going on. I'm moral. Right? And basically, that's actually a perverse form of morality where we shift the morality to the victim. Where it's like, how could you ask me to do this? Right? When in reality, you have an obligation to help. Especially if there's nothing there that prevents you from doing it. You see what I'm saying? No ends means justification that allows you to say, I really shouldn't help you because it would be immoral to do so. You notice there's only one character in the story. Right? So everybody else doesn't help because they don't want to. Which means one could make the argument that they are all complicit in the violence that happens to the princess. So ask yourself this question. How is the princess equally complicit to this other character? She's complicit, but how is she equally complicit to the other character? Well, but on the other hand, who is engaging in heroic practice? Who is taking the time to keep other people's needs in mind when deciding how to meet out the situation? Well, yes, but there's no harm in that. Is there?
No, I understand what you're saying, but
Right.
that's a separate paper. To me, it's a separate paper. We should now be looking at who is moral and not who is responsible for her.
Responsibility is a function of the criteria to arrive at moral action. Right? Responsibility, accountability is a moral question. Right? It's not a scientific question. Right? It's a moral question. It's a scientific question if there was water on the floor and we needed a camera to determine who dropped the water on the floor. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a difficult moral dilemma in which everybody should have some responsibility. The question is more responsible. That is a question of who behaved the right way in the situation. Okay. And so it isn't a separate question. It's actually a straight up the question.
And if it had been moral on here instead of responsible for her death, I would have totally agreed.
Well, think about criminal responsibility.
So,
Who would you put in order in criminal responsibility? Would you ever put the victim in top?
Yes.
But we're also looking at who's responsible for her death. She is
Of course, and number 6, the person who comes in 6th on the list is not devoid of responsibility. Everybody bears responsibility. The question is number 6 more responsible than number 5? Is number 5 more responsible than number 4? Is number 4 more responsible than number 3, and so on? Okay? So everybody on the list is responsible. So your black or white assumption that if I allow, for example, the princess to not be as accountable as the other characters in the story, she somehow escapes accountability. It's not.
Oh, no, I understand.
Right? You're still accountable. Everybody on the list is accountable. That's why we put those people on the list. Let's put every character in the story. If I assumed one character was not accountable, I wouldn't put them on the list.
Like
The
Batman
alligators,
is number 1,
right?
and we put the princess
The
as number
alligators
2.
are not accountable. They're not on the list. You see what I'm saying?
Put them on the
Okay, well, keep working. Let's see how it
What
goes.
did you put?
I put the princess.
How you guys doing?
Princess?
You got it all worked out?
2? And mine minus 1?
Yeah.
Alright, yes, okay.
Wait a minute, you put the people in order and then you develop the criteria? Okay, so you haven't actually put the people in order. And so you guys degenerated into a bunch of arguments and you're like, okay, let's establish criteria.
I mean, he's got it.
Okay, so let me see, what are you
But
coming
I
up
mean,
with?
like you were saying, that
Obligation to
another paper.
responsibility.
more
I
responsible.
really, Bruce says they're to be responsible, your physical relation to you.
I think the problem is.
Well, that's a causality question, right? And if that were true, then every victim would be responsible for what happens to them, because they're all responsible.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
understand that? So even if you have a snowy white victim who never did anything wrong, like, how about this? I have another version of the fairy tale where Princess goes missing.
I mean,
It says here, she asked to go for
The same stuff happens in the story.
but the best.
You come up with the same conclusion based on your criteria. If not, then your criteria is screwed up because it's assessing the character of the thing.
Same goes for her.
I mean, you understand what I'm saying? That's like saying the people on the plains were as responsible or more responsible than the terrorists who were on
He said, "I'm not a money."
Went to a lover to ask for a book.
right? The victims will always be proxy. So if that's true, then every victim is
No,
responsible for
I'm
what
not
happened
saying
because they were near
what
what
happened
happened.
that. He doesn't know, but all she's saying.
Yeah, I understand that. Choices are a function of responsibility. There's no doubt about it. There's no question. But what you have to ask yourself is, what are the outcomes and products of those choices? And how do we apply ends means to it? Right? In other words, if everybody's wrong, then what we have to do is decide which means justify which end. And if the end is murder, I'm not sure how any means are justified. Well, yes, but I mean, just think of it like just in the abstract. Think of it in terms of criminal responsibility. Would you ever be discussing the victim as one of the top 3 people who's responsible?
Would always be.
When do you blame the victim?
Would always be that because.
The victim is dead.
Yeah, okay.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and so in that sense, they are accountable. But on the other hand, everybody understands. Do you understand that? Like if the person at number 6 is only less accountable than number 5.
What's number 1?
Theoretically more accountable than number 7. Right? So the assumption that because you place somebody last, they escape accountability is ridiculous. And it's a black-white assumption that assumes that I must put that person first if I'm not going to put them last. Right? It doesn't say I can put them somewhere in the middle because we're not assessing levels of responsibility. You're responsible or you're not. But that's not how it works. Right? It works. It's levels of responsibility. Right? Who's more responsible than the person in front of you? And in order to do that, I think we have to look at a more complex equation on this. Who fulfills the responsibility for themselves? Right? Do you understand that? Like the real question is that he fulfills the responsibility for himself. The real question is who fulfills the responsibility for others. Let me ask you, who in the story fulfills the responsibility? Are there any characters in the story that make a clear ends means justification and then in the end make the argument that morally speaking they're better off doing what they're doing based on the fact that something might happen?
I think we could go through this.
I think there's one clear character.
That's my. Well, I'm not gonna hear it.
Somebody says, I can't do this for you because if I do, worse things will happen. Okay? So, there's one person who's attempting moral justification, right? Who actually has not only their own needs in mind, but is thinking about the other person's needs, taking the time to weigh them against one another, right? The other characters in the story simply refuse on justification. And they don't even engage in any reason, any argument whatsoever for why they refuse to help. And so ask yourself, did they have an obligation to help another person? See, if it's all about your obligation to yourself and people don't have an obligation to help, then theoretically the woman who's being chased by a rapist who knocks at somebody's door, the appropriate response to the person behind the door is to say, I'm not opening this door for you, and how dare you I do a rapist. Is that it? So that's what you would have based on what you're saying. Because you're responsible. Why'd you get in that situation? What did you do to create it? And in the end, why are you knocking on my door? A rapist might come and try to rape me. So I'm not letting you in. Are you kidding me? Well, the question is, who's responsible? And a function of who's responsible is who is acting ethically.
I mean, none of if the voting would have helped, then of course none of this would have happened.
I mean, like, just in the abstract, somebody puts a gun to your head and says, I'll kill you if you don't give me your money. We agree that that person is wrong, and then even if they put a bullet through my head because I refuse, I've done the right things, right? By not cooperating. Correct? Now, admittedly, from an ends means standpoint, maybe what I've done isn't necessarily the right thing because my life should be more valuable than the money in my pocket. But in the end, I have created a wrong by giving in my money, right? I have participated partially in a crime. See? So the morally correct answer is to let it put the bullet through my head, right? And then I die as a squeaky clean victim, right? Because I stood on a principle of morality, and then the guy shot me in the head.
Might as well put the principle.
But you hear what I'm saying. In the end, if I don't get killed in that equation, they're not going to charge me with not cooperating with a criminal, because not cooperating with a criminal is a crime, right? Just like when the government says, we won't cooperate.
I say we clear
with
them.
Americans, when they capture some Americans, and they say, I'm sorry, we're going to kill this guy if you don't cooperate. And the American government's like, we don't cooperate with terrorists, and then they take a big knife
Boatman would be
and they
cool.
cut Nick Burke's head off.
Boatman would be fine.
We blame the American government for that? Or is it the terrorist who's ultimately responsible?
Or either way.
Okay, so by that virtue, there's no way the victim could cut in front of the perpetrator's violence. Okay. Not possible.
Yeah.
And so ask yourself this: are there any clearly violent characters in the story? Madman?
Yeah, I think
Just as an aside, are there any clearly non-violent characters?
Princess was pretty good.
Choose non-violence. No. I think you can make the argument that every character in the story, other than the princess, is complicit in leading to her death because they all deny her money.
Man, yeah, I was about to
Right?
say.
So tacitly speaking, each one of those people committed an act of
Your
violence.
best friend did one.
Right? But on the other hand, there is at least one character in the story that justifies their act of violence by pointing out that by ends and means, a greater amount of violence will be meted out upon them if they do not act. Right? So we have one person who's at least tried to act ethically. Okay? And then there's another character in the story who participates in no way in hurting anyone other than perhaps themselves. As a matter of fact, could the princess have used violence? Does she have the capability of saying, I'll kill you if you don't cooperate? Or could she just look at the boatman and be like, you're 5'3", that madman's 6'3", I could wring your neck. And she just reaches out, strangles him, takes his boat, and goes across the river. That's a possibility, isn't it? But she chooses not to, doesn't she? With each character. Correct? Which means she has the option of violence, but she chooses non-violence. So you have two clearly non-violent characters and two clearly violent characters, and then a bunch of characters who are complicit in violence. So ask yourself, who is behaving ethically? And a function of that is then who's responsible for that?
No, she was out.
So, if indeed the victim is responsible for what happens, then we're kind of blaming the people on the plane. Right? Because they're responsible. So that makes the post. I understand. So let's chew on that for a moment. How's it going over here? You guys quiet? Okay. How's it going? You got it all decided?
Last year there was like this year they had like
Last year.
Because I was working with the same everybody was working with. I was doing it with stuff.
and I'm the man is number 1 is 17. Princess is 6. I should have put attack or attacker on the
That's what it is.
Like how do you
boatman
who's blamed more than the
Oh, yeah.
So what it turned into.
School levels in the third. I would love her. The prince is number two. He just said I'm two blocks.
What one? Well, I like that a break.
After that, how do you determine who's next? I'm assuming that it's level one.
Everybody got into
The best friends are
Oh, really? Oh, they're actually Let me ask you this. Isn't there some evidence?
I can't hear that.
I know a lot of people do it.
Yeah, that's not only when you kill the princess, you kill the princess. Kind of guys with murder.
If I have to sleep in a patio, I'm gonna be that serious. I'll say it like that.
Well, he's looking for proof. He's looking for the absence.
Okay.
I thought it was based on the session. I'm not sure. But everybody. Based on the story. So she makes this decision. Now, that doesn't mean you don't get paid. There are risks involved. They're still downloading. Why?
Actually, everything.
Told you. Cause you put one. Pretty much like.
So, ask yourself, who is more
Three.
Brother. Four. He was just a friend of one. Yes. Because he gave me and six.
Why see the princess?
You're six. She connected six. Princess is his love and character that is like everything wrong.
She did everything wrong. Oh my god.
No, I know she did everything wrong. He said she didn't. The princess could be number 5 or 6.
She did everything wrong. She obviously did it.
Obviously, she loved the castle, but he said when she goes to the proposal with marriage.
But still, what if the man
I know, dude, I understand. I totally think that.
I'm sorry, I'm taking it out.
No, it's okay. The princess should totally be number 1 or number 2. The man should be number 1. But apparently I'm wrong. So.
I'm not sure. Like, let's be honest. Who are the violent characters?
It doesn't matter about the.
So ask yourself this.
Oh my god.
Just remember, you can argue with opinions because no one's going to win.
Doesn't need to be that other than.
So there's no use.
If she would not
And this is no use. And this is the way that's don't argue with it because you just go on and on and on.
That's good. That's what we want.
Okay.
Feel the need.
But
I gotta be
based on
right.
level.
My sister was a princess who's got thrown over a big that.
Right?
You'll never be
The
right.
victim theoretically is the There's proof of it. There's proof of it too. Ask yourself this. Are there any non-violent characters?
So what did you guys get?
Is there anybody who keeps all of the
Wrong answers.
Didn't get like
We said Madman, Princess, Lover,
Anybody?
that is exactly what I just said. No.
No.
Every other character.
Calm down. Get out. Princess is 6. And he's one princess is 3.
Right? So they're all.
He said don't put it in the top 3.
Well, well, no,
I put her in the middle.
could she have
Just
committed
go
I
violation?
want to
along
put
with
you
her.
in the too. This is my Bible.
You kill either one of us.
Absolutely. And she paid the fair price, probably a much more fair price. Right? And so the point of the matter is, again, even if you put somebody in house their own hands, the question is, are they accountable? That's the problem is everybody in the list is accountable for murder. Right? And beyond that, I've written this forever myself, right? So I've engineered things in there. And our theory is, could the process of violence should step down.
Rage quit.
I better go be some energy. Not that cross. Couldn't she say this? Right? Or she could just decide that she's gonna wring the boatman's neck, right? Kill him and take his boat and go back across the river. And she'd probably get away with it because she's right? But she chooses not to do it. Why would that? But if you know she's concerned about it.
Computer within a computer. Oh, I saw that.
What
Yeah,
you're
it's all
saying
starts with
is,
Enterprise.
I would,
That was a
well, that's not really true. She goes,
That's at the corner of the video description.
In the end-
Lost the data corrupted.
in the end, she tries to cross the bridge, and she didn't try to kill him. She tries to cross the bridge and get around. But the point of the matter is, she does feel it. Because she could have used violence. If she was truly concerned about her own needs and what she wanted, then why wouldn't she use violence? Why wouldn't? Everybody else would. This is a violence position. You can hardly blame her for lying on her. Right? You can hardly blame somebody who throws somebody else in front of the truck. The truck's gonna hit them and, you know what I'm saying?
The PS3
Somebody
doesn't
might be like, hey man, it was either me or him.
He actually
But in
made
this case, she doesn't do that. She actually sacrifices herself for.
Oh,
We have 15
While
minutes
she
to
has
wrap.
committed an act that could
no.
she is the only
There is no
character
excuse.
in the story who remains other than that. Except Frank, who makes an instant. She says, I went for it. Kill you, and so I'm not gonna help you. While I want to, I can't do it. I'll not.
Computer within a
That's a
computer.
fairly
Which is
reasonable
all
argument.
in a computer.
One most people accept. The other people offer
No,
no
but Brett's,
explanation.
Brett's,
The
you
lover
can
says,
actually make a,
hey, I'm
it's
just
not
a
a
dude.
powerful thing,
I ain't no
but you
money.
can make it.
I'm a
Brett's,
That's his reason.
that's easy.
Would not
That's
have.
actually,
See what I'm saying? So you have to ask
And,
yourself,
you know,
I don't know the dimensions, but it was enormous, but it was enormous.
oh, snap, I don't know. There's a lady present, I apologize. That's also there.
I think it proceeds from standard assumptions of reality. I mean, ask yourself this.
Did you get what I
what
said? Okay, I apologize.
You know what I'm talking about, right? It's like a little game where you guess you did.
That's a lot.
Colonel Russell said, right? You know what I'm talking about? You notice on the old card, they give you all the
I just figured the fact that we
perpetrators and
had.
suspects. Mr. Bond, on that list, was not Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond was not Mr. Bond. You can't be like, Mr. Bond is just assault. Why?
Yeah, that's,
Doesn't make any sense.
I mean, I'll probably never really know how to the ups and downs of Redstone, but it's amazing.
They begin with something that nobody ever started. But they're making an assumption that no rational person would ever do that. So to me, standard morality says, I mean, ask yourself what would you say? According to the morality of the Bible, we should just let this person go. That kind of stuff.
He's still down there. I know, but he's got his
Yes, I
his
understand
own
that,
opinion.
and the way what Jesus would do with that would be to say
WWE.
that means that I need help because just because you're a sinner doesn't make you better. Right? But what these people do with it is, I don't like it, so I'm not going to help at all, which makes them complicit in an understatement. Arguably, right? So hardly society.
Or she drowned first before you.
This is true.
Say she drowned?
Yeah, it says drown and then eat. But no, sir. It is still the man.
No, I think they're very.
Again.
Well, anyway, let's go around the room real quick and have a quick discussion about the various solutions that we've come up with. And like I said, I told you we're probably not going to get to the rest of it. We'll probably have the lecture that explains what I think on Tuesday, but it'll give us a chance to chew on this. Yes. Oh, did I? I'm sorry. Oh, whoa! I didn't even do that. Oh, thank you. Okay, let's start over here. What I want to do is I want to just take a moment to hear what your order is, and then we're going to try to develop what I would call a couple of reasons based on the people in the story. So we'll start princess.
We've got reasons already. We'd like to hear them.
Yeah, I understand. We are going to do them. Madman, lover, boatman, friend. Okay. So in your formulation, who's first?
Madman.
Madman. Why?
Because he killed the person.
Okay. He did it. And let me ask you, is the fact that he took everything from her and that she'll never have anything else left, is that a factor in making him number one because he took more from her than, say, the prince or any other character in the story? Is that a factor? Is the level of harm that you're talking about a factor in determining the level of responsibility? Right? Like we decided that the terrorists on the plane were probably most responsible for what happened on 9/11, and then Bin Laden would be running a close second. Although sometimes people will debate, right? But between those two individuals, they'll say, well, Bin Laden planned the attack, so maybe we should put him first. But for the most part, I think there's a better moral argument that the terrorists flew the plane belong first because they took so much away, right? They were the last point of contact, the last ability for somebody to make it into the city. Okay, I'm with you. Madman first. So far, I agree. What's next?
Second, France. We didn't make a lot of France. A lot of.
Yeah, and let me just say, violence is part of the Madman's character, and violence is part of the Prince's character. And I'm with you there. Hey, they're the two violent characters in the story, right? And so, theoretically, we're trying to find out who's responsible for the violence in the story. And so it seems perfectly logical that the two individual characters that threatened and committed violence would be the responsible parties for the violence in the story. Yes? Okay, so what's number 3?
The princess. She made all the decisions.
Okay.
And she made them impeachment and
Okay, but let me ask you this. Just because a person's making a lot of decisions, every victim makes more decisions than the perpetrators will, because they're the ones who's being chased, right? So they're always going to make a lot more decisions, right? And so this is not the same criteria as this and this. You realize that you switched criteria to put princess in the right? Before this, we were talking about level of participation in violence, and now we're talking about who made more decisions. Okay? So, hey, you don't have to fix it. I'm just pointing out that we reverted to another set of criteria to put the princess in the top 3. Because, arguably, I'll make the argument, because we succumb to that natural human impulse to be like, I want to blame people most involved. Right? And so in that sense, one can make the argument that, but here's the thing, the victim's always most involved. Right? They're always going to be closest to the point of contact. That's like saying the people on the plane are second most responsible to the terrorists because they were proximate.
No, but
Right?
with the plane, it'd be different if they knew there were terrorists on the plane. Where the
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Oh, wait. Previous knowledge.
Yeah.
That's a factor, right?
Because she knew there was a madman who was going to go for the body.
Well, she didn't know when she left the castle.
Not when she left the castle,
Right.
but she didn't have to go back into the castle.
Well, wait, but now there are hedges in the story for that. Why did she not want to go back to the prince? Because the prince, if she left and became Xena warrior princess, the prince would send his corsairs and they would come kill her, right? And she obviously believes that, right? She obviously believes that there is a greater threat from the prince and his corsairs than there is from the individual madman on the bridge, correct? So she makes a calculation, a perfectly reasonable calculation based on that. But you're absolutely right. She is responsible in some way for what happens because she doesn't conceive of other options. She sees herself locked into a cycle. But on the other hand, does that make her third most responsible? Because how is she complicit in the outcome? Right? She's actually, because she's making so many decisions, she's actually trying more than any other character in the story to get out of the outcome. Right? Which means theoretically she should be less responsible for the other character in the story. She's actually trying to stop the violence from occurring, and every other character is complicit in it happening. You see what I'm saying? So, I just want to point out that we suspended our way we were putting this all in order in favor of another way, and then we put the princess third as a result. And I just want to say that might have something to do with the way you assess her as a person. That's all I'm saying. Right? I have another version of the story where the princess goes into town to visit a sick friend who might die before the prince returns, and I get very different results. Right? But it really shouldn't matter, should it? We all agreed yesterday that the character of the victim is right? Remember, it doesn't matter if that person's going to conduct a drug deal. It doesn't matter if they're going to have a tryst with their lover. Right? Remember all that? And you guys were like, no, that stuff doesn't matter. Who would assess the moral character of the victim? That's ridiculous. You look at the act. You look at the way it's all played out. Right? Everybody said that to me. We all nodded in agreement. I said that it would be ridiculous to come up with an ethical framework that led to that. Right? So now we're testing it in actual practice and coming up with different answers. Okay, so what's next? Absolutely. Absolutely. She had advanced knowledge, meaning the prince warned her. Right?
But she was the one who knew about it. According to the information we're reading, she didn't, that's from the one who didn't.
But follow me if you will. That means she was the person expending the most resources to try to stop the violence from occurring. And no other character in the story is expending any resources to try to stop the violence from occurring. Now, which of those is that? See what I mean? Right? And beyond that, I knew that guy could shoot me in the head if I told him I wasn't going to give him my money. And yet, I chose to make a moral action as a result. But that doesn't make me responsible for what he did. Well, there's a difference here. First off, the warning the prince gave didn't say, when you leave this castle, there'll be a madman sitting on the bridge, and when you return, he'll kill you if you try to go back in. It wasn't that kind of warning. It was, brigands and pirates might attack you if you're out there, right? Which sounds like the kind of thing that everybody who operates a protection racket tries to say, right? And so really, what he's trying to say here is, what you need protection from is me, right? I'm the one you need protection from. Just like, like when Guido and Sal come up to you and they say, hey, we need to take out your garbage because if we don't take out your garbage, something might happen to your garbage. Who do you think is going to mess with your garbage? Guido and Sal are going to mess with your garbage. That's the essence of the protection racket. You need protection, but it's really protection from me. Right? You see what I'm saying? And so the prince is making protection racket claim. Right? And she is trying to not participate in said protection racket. And yet, we hold her highly responsible as well. So look, who's next? Who's next after the princess? Lover? Okay. Why?
Because he acted selfishly. However,
Okay, wait a minute now. So now the criteria is acting on other people's behalf. You see what I'm saying? You see how we reverted to another set of criteria? How come we didn't just start with acting on other people's behalf and order them all based on that? Because if that were the case, then the princess would end up like number 5. Yeah, I understand what you're saying there. I understand what you're saying. But on the other hand, if that's true, then anybody could threaten us. And then basically, if we disagree with them, like if I live in a fascist state where people tell me what to do and tell me what I can and can't do, arguably, morally speaking, I have an obligation to not act in terms of what they say. But I make a choice to comply. What we're really trying to say here is we should always comply with fascism. We should always do what oppressive people say. And then if something bad happens to us as a result, that's really our fault, not theirs. Anyway, who's next? Open, why?
because he also acted selfishly generally, I think he was probably
Okay, and then, although he had the most resources and the most ability to affect the outcome, that's what I'm saying. Right?
he's supposed to be the which
Yeah, but in the end, I will say, if you are the person with the most resources and you have nothing to lose, then one could make the argument you have a higher obligation to help out, right? Do you see how, for the last three people, you would clearly use a other people matter formula, whereas with the first three people, we didn't use that formula, so we could come up with this word.
But how do you know that they think that like he has an ability to do it? He like feel like there's something wrong with him.
Well, it's not present in the story, right? But the princess could have used that same level of violence against him as well, and you can see the fact of that in the equation. But that's because the princess is choosing not to use those forms of violence, which means she's acting heroically, right? She's chosen to choose a moral action as opposed to an immoral one.
we can look at it over doing things for others. It's hard to say that. The madman doesn't care about anything obvious. The prince is very present for her, but he has some sort of excuse there. The princess doesn't seem to care about what she expects by doing whatever she wants.
The princess chooses not to hurt or use coercion with every other character in the story, whereas every other character in the story coerces her.
So just her presence will count with the other people.
Yeah, but what you're saying is, if I'm chased by a serial killer in the street, I shouldn't go knocking on people's doors because that would bring them into it.
No, that's not.
I mean, that's kind of what you're saying. You're saying she shouldn't even be there, and so these people shouldn't be responsible for what happens to her. That's not true.
No, what I'm saying is that the princess threatened life to her than
Well, no, she didn't threaten lives. She didn't threaten anybody's lives. It's the madman and the prince that are threatening lives, right? She's not responsible for the threats that they have meted out. Okay, all right, good. What about you guys? What's your order? Tell me your order.
Alright, madman number one.
Okay.
The lover number two.
Interesting. Why?
Because he tempted her to leave the castle. And get back on her.
Okay, all right. Although I must say that to me there's a tinge of sexism there, right? Where it's like, oh, she didn't have any choice in that and all that stuff.
He didn't have a choice,
But I'm not sure what the criteria is here. I'm still trying to figure out how we're ordering these people. So who's next?
That's number three.
The prince is number 3 because
He read her, but overall he just wanted her to stay
okay, and who's number 4?
Vote me.
Oh, nice. Because
He was just being like this and just making me really aware.
but more responsible than the friend or the princess who does. Okay, all right. And then a friend is what? 5, and then princess is 6. Is that what you're saying? Okay, all right. I'm still not 100% sure as to what the consistent order that you used in order to order these people are. But on the other hand, I do see some logic to what you're suggesting. To me, it looks like participation in the levels of violence, right? Although I will say that I'm still a little dicey here, right? I'm not sure how the lover participates in producing the violence in the story, other than he's complicit by not helping. You see what I'm saying? Right? I mean, it's hard for me to see how he would be more responsible than the prince, for example, who actually threatened violence and led to the demise of the princess. But on the other hand, I can see how he would be on the risk maybe next.
Theoretically, and I know this is a very conventional story, if lover wouldn't have existed, then the princess wouldn't have been having tense relationships with the prince, thus the relationship never would have been put on edge, and the prince wouldn't have become violent in the first place.
Yeah, that's a very long, extended assumption. And beyond that, I'm not sure he has to be held accountable for something that he was doing that was about caring for another person. See what I'm saying? The real thing he's accountable for is why he didn't care when it happened. Right? Okay, good. What about you guys? Okay, and so what's your work? Okay? Sure. see where you guys are going. Prince is gonna come in fast.
Right. And the French team states this president and born all the different
But when does he become responsible for the things that he does that he Well, you see what I'm saying, right? The violent outcome would have occurred without parental violence. I mean, just from an ends means standpoint, doesn't that put him more importantly on the list? I think outcomes are relevant, and beyond that, each person had some idea of what was going on, and it's kind of hard from the story to tell how much information each character has. You kind of have to lead to a certain set of assumptions. But even so, I'm not sure that Prince not having. I mean, I believe he still had plenty of knowledge about what's going on, right? And he certainly.
That's what I said. You leave the danger. Leave it before what happened. And you warn her.
All right. Okay. We've got the summary of these arguments. We will discuss these arguments on Tuesday. Okay? Yeah, go ahead and turn in your fairy tales. That's fine. Turn them